Hi there, it's John from thediscard.com again, and this time we are looking at another one-ticket commander, this time around Daxos of Meletis. For one white and a blue, he is a 2/2 human soldier, cannot be blocked by creatures with power 3 or greater. There's a lot of 2-power stuff in this format, I think, this budget commander format, so we're going to have to do a little bit of work to get him through, but if he gets through and deals combat damage to a player, we get to exile the top card of their library, and then we get to gain life equal to that card's converted mana cost and cast the spell. Now, to be honest, this deck is not always necessarily going to want to cast Daxos. I think we're going to cast him if we have 3 mana open and nothing else we want to do, or if we have whatever his mana cost is plus the commander tax and nothing else to do. But most of the time, what this deck is trying to do is just get the ultimate innovation. We are talking completely unblockable creatures with unblockable, which nowadays is listed as cannot be blocked. It used to be called unblockable, I guess slightly different wording now to make that clearer for newer players or something like that. We also are looking at stuff with shadow, like Augur Ilvec here. It is a 1/3 with shadow. Sacrifice it at the beginning of your upkeep, and you can gain 4 life. Shadow, if you've never played with it, and that's totally understandable, it's a mechanic that has not been in the game for a long time. Shadow is basically, the creatures are in their own, you can think of them, they're in their own realm. They can only block or be blocked by other creatures with shadow. There are a handful of creatures in the game that say they can block creatures with shadow as though they didn't have shadow, but for the most part, they just cannot be blocked. So we're going to try and force through as much damage as we can with that. If you play Commander a lot, the creature with shadow that you're probably most familiar with is Looter Il-Kor. It is a 1/1 for 1 and a blue, and if it deals damage to an opponent of any type, draw a card and then discard a card. So more or less, it's like a Merfolk Looter, where you tap it to draw a card and discard a card, but in this case, you're dealing 1 damage to the opponent. This is a classic Future Sight card. It is a core rogue. Hopefully, we'll get to see some more core and stuff like that when we go back to Dominaria, but for now, we will settle with Looter Il-Kor. The other mechanic that we're using that is something we get to play in a format like this, this one-ticket commander format on Magic the Gathering Online that we really cannot do too much of in real life because of the cost, is horsemanship. So let's look at Zhang Fei, Fierce Warrior. This is one of many horsemanship creatures in the deck. Zhang Fei is a 4/4 vigilance horsemanship creature for 4 and 2 white. Horsemanship, if you've never played with it, again, totally understand if you've never played with horsemanship or maybe never even heard about it. It is a mechanic that was only used in Portal 3 Kingdoms, which was never released in the US. It was released mostly in Asian territories and a small release in English and European territories. Horsemanship is basically flying, but it's not flying. So imagine how a flying creature can block other creatures with flying and creatures without flying. Horsemanship is the same thing. So it cannot be blocked except by creatures with horsemanship, yet it can still block other creatures that don't have horsemanship. Unlike Looter Il-Kor, which is a creature with shadow that may show up in some commander builds, your opponent is never going to have something like Sun Che, Young Conqueror. Excuse my Chinese pronunciations. I do not speak Chinese, obviously. But Sun Che here, for 5 mana, he's a 3/3 horsemanship that when it enters the battlefield, you may return target creature to its owner's hand. So basically, it's a way for us to force through as much damage as possible. We are trying to race our opponent. We don't necessarily want to block all that much. We want to just push all of our damage through if possible. Some of my favorite creatures ever, the Beetles. They've only showed up on a handful of cards ever. They have 3 creature cards of their own, only 2 of which are legal in this format because one is in an unset. And then they appear on a few other cards. They were invented by Magic the Gathering artists who just sort of put them in some pictures, and they got a couple creatures of their own. Bouncing Beetles here is a 2/2 for 2 and a blue that is unblockable if the defending player controls an artifact, which in Commander you see a lot of artifacts. You'll see less of them in one-ticket Commander because your opponents really can't afford to keep too many mana rocks in their deck just because the cost has to be so low. But as somebody who really likes Beetles, I figured I'd throw them in. The other Beetles that I have are bubbling Beetles. This one is unblockable if the defending player controls an enchantment. To be honest, if I want to make this deck better, I cut this card. But this is one ticket commander. Come on, we're already doing some silly stuff. I want to play the fun cards that I remember loving as a kid. I'm shoving this card in the deck. Nurek Spy we have here, another 2/2 unblockable as long as defending player controls an artifact. This is another card that I sort of like because Mirrodin is one of the sets that I really first started being able to buy cards. You know, I'm in high school, I've got my first job, I can spend my own money on cards, and Nurek Spy is a card that I played around with. So I thought about this card and decided to throw it in. There are probably better unblockable creatures that I could throw in the deck. We have a couple low drops here. Gudul Lurker. This is a 1/1 that megamorphs as a 2/2. It's really just another unblockable creature. And then we have Slitherblade, a 1/2 unblockable. This card is really not getting played outside of some very niche Amonkhet draft decks. So I figured let's throw it in here. Blighted Agent. Infect and unblockable is pretty powerful. If we can pump this creature up, hopefully we can kill our opponent. We're playing a 1v1 commander here with the standard commander banned list. So our opponent has 30 life, excuse me. So if we can get them down to, basically having 10 virtual life with Infect, we'll definitely want to do that. We've got some generic unblockable creatures here, like Escape Artist. We can discard a card from our hand and return it to our hand, or return this creature to our hand for a blue. This is really just another unblockable creature. We could probably throw some other better unblockable creatures in the deck, but I wanted to have a few low drops because if we're trying to race our opponents, we need to have creatures on the board that can pick up some of these pump effects that we're going to talk about in a little bit here. We've got Flitterstep Eidolon. This one has Bestow. We're almost never going to use the Bestow part of this card, but we do have a handful of creatures, maybe 2 or 3 that don't have unblockable or something like that. So having this ability is definitely helpful. We've got Flacco Seer. This is just sort of an interesting secondary card to have here. It's 2 blue for a 1/1 shadow. When it leaves the battlefield, you draw a card. I think the biggest benefit of this is just it sort of cantrips itself if it dies. If our opponent wraths the board or blows it up, we get to draw a card. This one's maybe a bit of a liability because it's 2 blue and you really want to cast this turn 2 if you have it in your hand. But I figured it would be nice to try this out, see how it goes. Azurius Herald. This is a 2/1 for 3 mana. It's unblockable. It enters the battlefield to gain 4 life. And if you didn't pay blue as part of the 2 colorless mana there, or 2 generic, I should say, then you have to sacrifice it. So we're always going to want to play that and pay that mana. But a 2/1 unblockable that gains us a little bit of life for 3 is fine. We've got Latch Seeker, another just generic unblockable, this time a 3/1. I'm skipping over cards we've already talked about, by the way. We've got Phantom Warrior. This one's been around for quite a while as well. It's just a 2/2 unblockable for 3 mana. Shoe Cavalry. This is one of a number of horsemanship creatures. This one's a 2/2. The Soltari are shadow creatures. Anytime you see Soltari, it's most likely a shadow. This time, Soltari Champion. This is, I think, secretly one of the best cards in our deck. It is a 2/2 unblockable because it's shadow. And whenever it attacks, other creatures you control get +1/+1 until end turn. So we're relatively low to the ground deck here, and getting to pump the rest of our creatures who are also almost certainly unblockable, it's going to force through a lot of damage. So Soltari Champion, one of the best cards on our deck. Satara Crusader, this one has pseudo fire breathing. It's shadow again for 2/1. We can pay 2 mana to give it +1/+0 until end of turn. If we end up giving this Infect later on, we basically get to pump all of our mana through over the course of a couple turns to try and kill our opponent as quickly as possible. Soltari Visionary, this one is a 2/2 with shadow again for 3 mana, a little bit harder to cast at 1 and 2 white. But the cool part of this is it's almost like a Trigon Predator. Whenever it deals damage to an opponent, you get to destroy an enchantment that player controls. I don't think we'll see too many enchantments in this format, but having that utility is definitely helpful. We get to use a creature that is dealing damage to also be an answer for enchantments. I think that's pretty helpful. Flacco's Dream Sower. This is another shadow creature. This one I think is kind of an interesting piece of control. We can use it to sneak through some damage. It's only a 1/1 for 3 mana. This is one of the biggest downfalls of this deck is most of our creatures are really small. We're not going to see a 3/2 or something like that for 3 mana. We're seeing 1/1s and 2/2s even up to the 3 and 4 mana slot. But this one has a cool ability. You get to choose not to untap it during your untap phase. And whenever it damages an opponent, you can tap a creature. And as long as it remains tapped, that creature doesn't untap during its controller's untap step. So we can get through some damage. And if they have a creature we really need to stop, we can just say, hey, we're going to choose not to untap Flacco's Dream Sower. We'll keep that other creature tapped down. One thing to note, if your opponent does not have any creatures on the board, this is not a May ability. You have to target a creature. So you are likely going to have to target the Flacco's Dream Sower or some other creature that you have, just to use that ability. So you really want your opponent to have something. Otherwise, you do not want to attack with this card. Flacco Scout. This one is another 2/1. Again, you see here we've got a lot of, the 3 mana and 4 mana slots are 2 or 1 power. This is just another generic shadow. We can choose to discard a card and return it to our hand. We're probably not going to want to do that, but in this format, I think particularly when you have a creature-based deck, you want to protect those creatures, particularly late game if your opponent has some kind of wrath effect. So having the ability to say, we've got too many lands, we're going to keep one in our hand and pitch it if our opponent plays a wrath effect, that just sort of helps you get back on the board a little bit faster. Uninvited Geist, this is a 2/2 with Skulk, meaning it cannot be blocked by creatures with greater power. When it deals combat damage to a player, you transform it into a 3/3 unblockable. And then one of our only creatures without evasion of any kind is Kongming Sleeping Dragon. This one here is just a 2/2 with an Anthem effect. All your creatures get +1/+1. We're going to go quickly through these. Lucian, Scholar General. This is another Portal 3 Kingdom cards. It is a 1/3 for 4 with Horsemanship, meaning my opponent is likely never going to be able to block it, but it can block if it wants to. This one's got a sweet ability. Whenever it deals damage to an opponent, you get to draw a card. So basically, it's a guaranteed 1 damage draw card every single turn, which, again, in this format, having a creature that gets to do some of the stuff that cards you want to play cannot play because they're too expensive, it does those abilities. That was kind of a convoluted way of saying that sentence, but you get to draw the card, you get to ping your opponent one, and it can hold equipment or something like that. Flacco's Deceiver. This is another one of those Flacco's cards. It's a 1/1 with Shadow, this time for 4 mana. So again, you can see here, we're not getting a great rate on these creatures. We're trading off by having them be unblockable. But this one's got a really cool ability. You can sacrifice it if it attacks and is if it attacks and is not blocked. You can sacrifice it, and then you take one of your opponent's creatures permanently. So if your opponent has something really good on the board that you want to steal, something that's going to kill you, this just gets to take it. So if you get to attack with Flacco's Deceiver, you get to have that creature forever. Or again, if you need that 1/1 unblockable, you can use that. We've got Thistledown Liege, which is just going to pump our creatures +1/+1. I don't think we have any other. Yeah, we have no other multicolored creatures, so no creatures getting +2/+2 from this. But it's an instant speed Anthem effect on a body. We've got Viral Drake. This one is one of the only creatures that is, it's maybe one of 2 or 3 that is not unblockable, but it is a 1/4 flying infect, and you can pay 4 mana to proliferate. So if we do end up going the route of the infect, we're going to pump our mana into that, and we're going to try and kill our opponent quickly with infect. Again, it does have flying though, so that's helpful. Covert Operative. This is a really generic card. Maybe one of the worst in our deck, but it's still worth playing, I think. It is a 3/2 unblockable for 5 mana. We've got Guan Yu, Sainted Warrior. This is another horsemanship creature. For 5 mana, we get a 3/5, and whenever it's put onto the battlefield, when it's put into your graveyard, from the battlefield, you can shuffle it back in. So a minor effect there. It's really just a 3/5 unblockable that can block. We've got Infiltrator, Lil Core. This is a 3/1 for 5 mana with Shadow, but you are probably not frequently going to pay that. It's got Suspend 2 for 2 mana. If you haven't played with Suspend lately, Suspend basically means you exile this with that many time counters. So this time it'll have 2 time counters. You pay that Suspend cost, and then once you remove the last time counter, which you remove a time counter every upkeep, you get to cast that spell for free. And it has haste as well. So really, turn 2, you're going to throw this down. A couple turns later, you're getting a 3/1 haste that your opponent is not going to block. We have a couple of utility creatures as well, like Angelic Skirmisher. This is a 6-mana 4/4 flyer, and then at the beginning of your upkeep, you get to choose First Strike, Vigilance, or Lifelink, and all of your creatures get that ability until end of turn. So that's the beginning of each combat, including your opponent's, and you get to choose one of those abilities. So, for example, you can choose Vigilance. I'm going to attack with all of my unblockable creatures with Vigilance, which basically means your opponent is taking that damage. There is absolutely nothing they can do without destroying your creatures or tapping them down before you attack. And then on their turn, you get to say First Strike. So now they get to attack into all of your First Strike creatures. So there's a lot of cool stuff you can do with Angelic Skirmisher. I think it's worth having that creature without unblockable in the deck because of that. And then on the high end, we've got 2 creatures that are really, really expensive here, 7 and 8 mana. We're not necessarily going to cast them a lot, but when we do, it's going to be a big deal. Scrapdriver Servant. Serpent is a 5/5, is unblockable as long as a defending player controls an artifact, so it's in the same family as the Beetles there. Frankly, a little disgusted with Wizards that they didn't make it a Beetle, but hey, you know what? It's Mirrodin, it's not Dominaria, I will live with it. And then Tidal Kraken. Tidal Kraken is just a 6/6 unblockable. At 30 life, your opponent cannot take too many hits from Tidal Kraken without dying. All right, will not spend too much time with the rest of the stuff in this deck. I know this is already going a little bit longer than my last deck tech. I guess the last creature wraps around here, Deep Sea Kraken, another 6/6 unblockable. This time for 10 mana. However, it has suspend 9, for 2 and a blue. And I really like this because you're not really going to hard cast this. I think if the game's gone that long and you haven't won with this deck, you're not hard casting it most likely. But suspend 9 for 3 mana. The dream is you put it down on turn 3, suspend 9, and then it has this great ability, sort of like there's sort of a cycle of these creatures from Time Spiral that when something happens, you remove a time counter. In this case with Deep Sea Kraken, whenever an opponent plays a spell, you get to remove a time counter from it if it's suspended. So your opponent is either going to sit there and say, hey, I can't play my spells because they're going to get the 6/6 unblockable, or they're just going to play into it and you're going to get to race them. You're going to get the creature super early for almost no mana here, and you're going to race. That's really what this deck is about. It's about racing with no consequences. Spells, we have some removal here. We've got Condemn. We've got Swords to Plowshares. We've got, what else we have? Oblation. Surprisingly, only 0.01 or 0.02 tickets here to shuffle a non-land permanent into its owner's library, and then they draw 2 cards. If you're casting Oblation, you're maybe killing their commander or something. Them drawing 2 cards, not the end of the world. They can certainly get an answer for you, but that is unconditional removal there. You're getting rid of something. And then we also have Day of Judgment here, Wrath of God, more or less. They can regenerate, but let's be honest, they're not regenerating most of the time. And then what else do we have here? That's really all of the removal. We don't have too much removal in the deck. Then we have a bunch of draw spells. Compulsive Research, Council of the Soratami, another generic draw spell. Fabricate is sort of a draw spell. Obviously, it's a tutor, but you don't have a huge amount of stuff you're going to get, but there is some really important stuff that we can get with it. So we'll look at that in a bit. Frantic Search. This is just a great draw spell. You draw 2, discard 2, untap up to 3 lands, so it's basically free if you have 3 mana. Tragic Lesson. This card has been performing really well for me. You get to draw 2 cards and then discard a card unless you return a land to its owner's hand, a land you control to its owner's hand. So at instant speed, you can draw those cards, and you get to decide if you want to discard after you draw those 2 cards. So if it's your turn, you haven't made a land drop, you can draw those 2 cards, and then if they are not a land and you have no other land in hand, you can return one of the lands you tap for Tragic Lesson and then just play it. So it's like getting an extra mana or 2 there for free when you cast the spell and draw some cards. We've got Careful Consideration, another draw spell. Deep Analysis, great draw spell. Totally worth paying 3 life to get to use the spell a second time in a format where you're starting above 20 life to begin with. And then we have Tidings, of course, just to draw 4 cards. And Treasure Cruise. Treasure Cruise in this specific format we're playing is allowed. It's banned in a lot of other formats. So we're definitely going to want to take advantage of that if we can. 1 mana draw 3 is busted. There's a reason it's banned in a lot of formats, but until it's banned in one ticket commander, we're going to be playing that. Let's see. The rest of the deck is more or less focused on killing our opponent by pumping up our creatures or providing some other advantage that gets really valuable when our opponent can't block anything. Let's see, what do we have here? So we have, I guess we could start with, let's see, Charge Across the Araba. This is a card that you're going to only want to cast it when it wins you the game. It is a 5 mana instant. It's arcane. It's from the Kamigawa block. Hey, no hating on Kamigawa. I love that set, or that block. This one has Sweep, which is an ability which basically says return any number of planes you control to their owner's hand. Creatures you control get +1/+1 until end of turn for each plane's return this way. So if my opponent can't block my creatures, I've got 4 or 5 creatures out, and I've got 4 or 5 planes out. I'm going to cast this, return all those planes to my hand, and my opponent is probably going to lose. Charge Across the Araba is just sort of a blowout there. We also have, let's see here, Loxodon Warhammer. This is just a classic utility card. The creature gets +3/+0, has lifelink and trample. This card is sort of a balancing act in most decks where you have to determine, is it worth spending 3 mana on this card and 3 mana to equip to throw it on a creature when the creature doesn't get any additional toughness because my opponent can just block it. Maybe they'll try to remove the Loxodon Warhammer. In this format, they cannot block it. In this deck, they cannot block it. So they're just going to take an additional 3 damage plus whatever is on that creature naturally, and then we're going to gain that life. This is just another thing to speed things up. Stratos Ice, this card is, I think, very overlooked. You'll see here, it's 2 cents in Magic Online. What Stratos Ice says is you get to imprint it when it enters the battlefield. You search your library for a land card, exile it, and shuffle your library so that exiled land is imprinted on Stratos Ice. An equipped creature gets +2 or +1/+1 for each land on the battlefield of the same name as that exiled card. In this format, you can't afford very many non-basic lands. In fact, we're playing none in this deck. And our opponent very likely has islands because blue is one of the most popular colors. So we can just say blue, or maybe just whatever of the 2 lands we have the most of. And that creature now gets pumped up by that much for the number we have. So it's very easy by the time you get Stratos Ice and equip it that the creature's getting +3/+3 or +5/+5 or something crazy like that just from this one card. And of course, like any other equipment, your opponent can deal with the creature. The equipment sticks around, so they've got to find a way to deal with it. And that works particularly well when we look at Grafted Exoskeleton. This is one of our main win conditions. It is a 4 mana equipment that equips for 2, and equipped creature gets +2/+2 and has Infect. And then if Grafted Exoskeleton becomes unattached from the permanent, you sacrifice the permanent. So that clause is not going to happen very often, but again, you can imagine if we've got a lot of unblockable creatures, we put a very short clock on the opponent. We essentially take their life from 30 to a virtual 10 with Infect. And you can imagine if we get Stratos Ice or Loxodon Warhammer on there, we could potentially take the opponent out in 1 hit. We also have some other Anthem effects here. We've got Always Watching, which gives our non-token creatures, which is all of our creatures, by the way, +1/+1 in Vigilance. We've got Glorious Anthem, which just gives them +1/+1. We've got Marshal's Anthem, which gives them +1/+1 with the multi-kicker that allows us to return creatures from the graveyard. And then we have Bident of Thassa, which will let us draw a card. Again, this is another card that gets very, very good when you consider that your opponent cannot block any of your creatures. And then True Conviction, another similar effect here. Creatures you control have double strike and lifelink. So we don't need too many creatures out with too much power and toughness to really outpace our opponent when our creatures all have double strike and lifelink and our opponent can block them. So that's really the deck there. I don't expect to cast Daxos that often because he's going to be blocked by a lot of stuff. But when we get to cast him, I think he's going to be really good. Otherwise, this deck is just about racing and punching through as much damage as fast as possible. This was inspired largely by deck that I used to run in high school in our 5-color singleton format. I can't remember if it was 200 or 250 cards, but we played this singleton format with Scribble Ante, where you anteed up a card that your opponent would draw on, and it was singleton. We had to have all 5 colors, and one of the best decks I ever built in that format was a deck that was full of creatures with land walk abilities. I had almost every creature that was 1 mana that had a land walk, or 2 mana that was a land walk within each of those colors, and it just meant that my opponent can never block my creatures. So I put a little bit of removal in the deck, swing in, and pretty soon you just sort of take combat out of the equation, because it's the number that's on your creature's power subtracted from their life every single turn without question, and it really just sort of gets there. I think formats like this, where you're playing with a single ticket, or in this case 1.09 tickets, again, we've touched on how the prices change over time, it just gets really hard to deal with if your opponent is sitting around trying to use some other strategy like tribal or control or something like that. They're trying to make some strategy that works in other formats work in this format, and all your creatures are just unblockable. It sort of shows you the power of some of these other formats, like some of the recent limited formats where blocking is so bad because there's so many creatures that stop you from blocking. You can see why a deck like this, I think, can get there. So we'll see how it goes. We'll see how Corey responds with his blue-black rogues, and then if we get to face off against another deck, we'll get to see how it plays against that. But overall, I'm really happy with how it turned out. I'm very, very excited to get to play with this deck. Like I said, it's a deck that I've wanted to play with for a very long time, and I think it's going to get there. So check it out. We'll see how it does, and thanks for watching.